Back at it again. This week, what are we going to talk about? So, I thought I'd take something I was learning from this book about self-image and stuff like that, and how we present the idea of ourselves, in everyday life and in the kind of modern world. And it's a book that what prompted me was a book written by this guy called Irvin Goffman or something along those lines. Written for the 1960s. Don't get me wrong, there's some, things there that are of the time, which don't really relate today, or, examples that, probably would be considered racist. But the overall ideas and frameworks that he's talking about, I think, are relevant and are something we should be aware of, because it's something that people are, you yourself and me, myself, doing every day, and everyone we interact is doing it, is following a similar kind of thing. And to understand that kind of process, I think, more power to us, because, that gives us a better idea of what's really going on and why people do the things that they do. So to start it off, he kind of talks about, obviously the way to frame it, or the beginning of the framework, is kind of, the whole idea of the stage and, theatrical. And he talks about in this word, I don't know if it's even a real word, one he made up, was dramaturgical. So like actions are not perceived in just like what you do or say or whatever, but it's the drama and, essence of what you're saying, and how that, relates to the scenery and the tonality and the reaction and the audience, and that's pretty much the basis of what he kind of frames it as. Is you have a performer, or like, someone who's acting a role, and then you have an audience, which, like, if you watched a live theatre performance, is, kind of how it's done. Now, he does state in the book that, this example, that example, and that framework to, use as an analogy isn't perfect, and, obviously there are, probably countless examples of where that's not the case. And, but you can see the general gist of why that is kind of, used as a way to explain the framework that he brings forward. So the beginning part of it really kind of centers around about what interactions are about, and when you are performing, or when you are, interacting with other people, you are performing a role. You are trying to, in kind of what he was saying was, you're trying to define the situations in which you are perceived. So through your actions and, your pageantry, so how you present yourself otherwise, in dress, and how you cut your hair, and, do all that, your facial expressions, your tonality, on top of, kind of external things like the scenery that you're in, what location, stuff like that. All of these add to the definition, or the way you want people to perceive that role, that character you are playing, because there are certain qualities and, essences that you want them to associate with you, or at least in the confines of the performance you are putting on. So that's what a lot of interaction in what he's saying is about, is trying to perform a role, perform an act, and define how the audience perceives us, to affect how they react to us, or their opinion of us. And to go into the next level of detail of how we kind of go about that, he breaks it down further to what he calls, the front stage, or the front, and then the backstage. So to understand the front stage, it's pretty much what I told you earlier. It's the things like the pageantry, what you're saying, how you say it, your expressions, your body posture, the location, the scenery, all of that is part of the front. It's what's on stage, it's what's on display. But then there's also a backstage. And what that is, and if you think about, a perfect, let's take a restaurant as an example of, the front and backstage. The dining hall and, the entrance into the building and into the restaurant is, it's your front. It's the place where the audience or the potential customer gets all their immediate impression, or, impression from everything that they see in the dining room and in their way into the restaurant. Now, the backstage is the kitchen. that's where all the preparation and all the handling and all the, you know, putting on airs kind of, you know, is prepared and gets ready, you know. And what he kind of distinguishes is the people that are performing roles in the front, you know, when you're out in the front, you know, on the stage, the way you perform and you know, carry yourself, it can be a lot different to how you would carry yourself if you're an actor and you move into the backstage. So, you know, imagine a waiter. You know, a waiter, while they're out serving tables, have to, you know, be courteous, have to be polite, have to be attentive and stuff like that. They have to, you know, look respectable and polite and all that. But once they get back into the kitchen, you know, they can use, you know, they can talk shit with the cooks and the prep staff and all the, you know, culinary people. You know, they can slouch and, you know, kind of, they're in their own space. They're in a protected space where they're not on display, so they don't have to be playing that role of that very, you know, assiduous and well you know, defined character of what a waiter is in most people's mind. They don't have to play that role. That instead they can kind of be a little bit more themselves, and, you know, although they have to be polite, you know, to, you know, the customers, you know, once they get into the kitchen, they can kind of talk shit and, you know, and be rude without the actual audience, you know, hearing them. They can kind of talk back to them and, you know, give themselves a little bit of catharsis and stuff like that. So it's kind of framed through that perspective, and you can view that also when, you know, you're entertaining friends at home. You know, the living room and your kitchen, your living room and your kitchen and your like, you know, your dining spaces. These are all like areas of the stage where it's all about the, you know, the presentation and where you perform your role of being a good friend, a good husband, or like, you know, a good partner, and, you know, kind of all of that, or whatever role that you are trying to, you know, affect in other people's minds. But, you know, then you have your bedroom and maybe your private bathroom. Those things are backstage, you know, like the audience isn't allowed to go into there. So your friends wouldn't really be allowed to go in there, you know, willy-nilly. Like there would have to be, there usually is some sort of restriction, or they needed to be invited into those kind of spaces because, you know, they're seen as private. But if you view it through this framework of the stage and the backstage, it's a backstage area. It's an area where the domain is completely different. And, you know, I don't know if you ever noticed this yourself. Like sometimes when you go into a friend's bedroom, you'll take on an air of uninterestedness, like almost like you're not paying attention to, you know, the trinkets and things around in their room. You kind of just feign interest because you're not, in theory, you're not meant to see this part of the production, because this is where it all kind of comes together before it goes out on stage. So you're not really meant to be privy to this, but, you know, if you've been invited in, you kind of, you yourself as an audience member in that capacity will take a different kind of viewpoint, or like a different, you know, way of carrying yourself along through the situation. Moving on forward, he talks about how we tend to use one of two things, because when we're trying to project this image, or when we're trying to fulfill this role, we have certain tactics and things that people use to keep it all consistent and coherent. Because what can kind of derail a performance or an interaction is you're trying to broadcast this image and this ideal, or, you know, this idea of who you are, but when information or certain you know, mishaps happen in the interaction that are inconsistent with what you're trying to bring forward, that can, you know, be very detrimental to the interaction you're trying to have. So, you know, what it immediately comes to mind is, let's say you're selling a product to someone, and then, you know, you're in the middle of let's say you're a salesperson or something like that, and you're in the middle of a sale and you're just about to close it or whatever, and then a disgruntled customer that you've previously, you know, sold to comes in and goes, "This thing you sold me is a piece of shit, yada yada yada," you know, it all falls apart, because with the new customer, you're trying to project this idea that you're a trustworthy person, the product is good, you know, this is you're someone you can trust to make to buy off. But then you have this new person entering the scene, and completely just the new information they're bringing in makes the audience think that the role you are putting on isn't consistent with who you are or with the situation at large. the reality changes, and and then the sale can fall through because, well, there's that disconnect that and it's just not, it just doesn't work out. And now it's hard to say, like, in all the countless examples where that can kind of play out, but you can understand the general gist of what I'm trying to get at, where you can see that inconsistency. So we try to do things to prevent against that. So he talks about defensive and protective measures. So defensive measures are what, the individual, the actual actor themselves, the performer, as you were, can do. Meanwhile, protective is more like what the audience can do to save the ideal of, like, what we're trying to bring forward. Because the funny thing is, we all kind of inherently know we're trying to play out roles in life. Like, we're trying to cast these images. We all know it because we're all subconsciously doing it ourselves. So we all somewhat know the dance, and we kind of give each other slack on it a little bit, which is just how we kind of, grease the nature of social interaction so they become more smoother. So the defensive mechanisms, and I don't want to go into all of them, but I'll go into one of them, which is gradual disclosure. So when you're meeting someone for the first time, you're not usually very, you're not super open with them, as you would be like with a friend. It's really more, you kind of do what he talks about, like gradual disclosure, where maybe you're talking about, I don't know, maybe politics or something like that, right? And your political views. You let out a little bit of information, you put out a little bit of a feeler, and then if the audience in response gives no negative reaction to what you've essentially put out, or finds that it's acceptable for you to put that information out, what can end up happening is you'll then kind of go a little bit deeper and go that little bit extra more, disclosure of information and your views on the subject, or all the values you kind of hold. And it kind of goes back and forth. Every single time they kind of approve you being able to, disclose that far, it's, you can go another layer deeper. But then once you get to the point where the person no longer approves, that's when you kind of cut it off there, like, and you no longer make any more disclosures. And with the last comment that was, not received well, you can kind of play it off as I didn't really mean that. Oh, yeah, I was just kidding. Or like you come up with some way to downplay it and not actually have that attached to whatever that previous or the last disclosure was, not have that kind of idea attached to you. And then you can kind of distance yourself from it, which then kind of saves the performance that you're putting on. And then when it comes to protective measures, this is what the audience can do. And it's kind of, it's what he describes as having tact. So if the audience has tact, they're employing protective measures. So I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where, let's say, you've got a friend and and maybe it's at a party or something like that, and you're in the process of introducing them to someone else, or like, the other person might be someone you know, or it might actually just be a stranger you don't know at the party, and your friend's talking, and it's like, and then they say something that's a bit of a gaffe, a bit of a social faux pas. What you can do as an audience member, as what he talks about, protective measures, is you can jump in and kind of, audience participation. You can kind of play it off like similar to what you did with the defensive measure. You can make it sound like a joke, or oh no, they didn't really mean that, or you can spin the meaning of what they were saying to be something that doesn't affect the same kind of negative reaction in the other audience member, the third person in this situation. So you kind of protect your friend who's playing his role out, who's trying to, be seen as someone to know, or someone that you want to get to know, or something like that. So it kind of gives you that ability as an audience member to kind of participate and shift how a performance can move. And the final kind of conclusion of what he kind of talks about is that although there's the performance and the idea of, you're trying to project this character, there is also the actor as the performer, or the performer as an actor, really. So think about it like this: like when I see, Brad Pitt in a movie or something like that, like he's playing a character, and I'm like, and he'll do, and depending on the role, he'll, and obviously the director's advice, he'll carry himself and act on screen in a certain way that gives me an idea of the essence of the character he's trying to play, like to the point that if it's believable enough, you honestly do believe that person, that character is on screen, and this fictional person that doesn't exist, is real and has these qualities. Meanwhile, you also know that Brad Pitt is an actor. Like at the end of the day, like devoid from the movie or whatever, he is still an actor playing a role. And so there's that kind of double channel stream where if something goes bad in the performance or whatever, it's not the character being played that gets the real life punishment or the real life negativity that comes from those mishaps and that inconsistency in the performance. It's the actor behind the character that actually like kind of faces the consequences. So it's to understand that capacity as well. It's never, the character isn't real. Like the people we're projecting aren't real, and the effects and ideas we're trying to bring into people's minds aren't necessarily real. They're just like an imaginative conception of what you are, but they're not real. So they can't face consequences, and they don't actually get a negative repercussions socially and in other capacities as well. It's you, the actor, that kind of faces that. Now, how this relates to what we kind of talk about and in general on this channel is that you have to understand the roles you play out in life. So I think that's something that is worthwhile, and it's something I've been looking at, and there's all sorts of angles of analysis that you can look at it, like through, for me personally, I can look at it as the role of the character I play as, a biostatistician at work, or as a brother to, or a son and stuff like that. So I'm only early on because I've just only finished the book, but looking at how the performances I put on and why I do certain things when I'm interacting with certain people to affect different changes and to certain ideas of myself that I want to put into their minds. Like, why do I do certain things? And then thinking about that and whether it's worthwhile, or if the things I'm doing aren't necessarily affecting the changes I want, then thinking, okay, what do I need to do in those circumstances to get the impact that I want to bring in? Because, oh God, what is that old saying? Life is a stage. And I can't even remember the ending of that part. Oh well, that's embarrassing. But have a think about it. Think about yourself and the characters you play, that you play out in the everyday world, and think about how you are putting your performance on. Like, is it one that still needs work, or do you think maybe that you possibly are getting the results that you want when it comes to, the effects and the impacts you're having in people's minds, and whether, or are your actions or the way you carry yourself or the scenery that you're kind of putting forward, is that inconsistent with the character and role you were trying to play? So give that a bit of a thought, and, if you feel up to it, you can comment it in the comment section, and, we'll have a discussion down there. But besides that, that's going to be it for this week. And, leave a like and a share and a subscribe, and that'd be greatly appreciated. Thanks.